And I'd like to call tonight's hearing to order. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Arbor Rice, and I'm President and CEO of the New York Urban League. My co-chair, Henry Garrido, is unable to join us today. I'd like to thank Lehman College's president, Fernando Delgado, and the whole CUNY team for hosting us today. This commission has been empowered to conduct a thorough review of the city charter and craft proposals that we will put before the voters. This is our fifth hearing in our fifth borough. We have had the privilege of hearing from experts and advocates on a wide range of issues that will inform our decision-making, and look forward to hearing from the public on those ideas. While this commission was convened via local law passed by the City Council, we are an independent body. It is our goal to hear from experts and everyday New Yorkers to propose substantial, effective amendments to the charter. Any proposals, regardless of the merits that can be achieved by local law, will likely not be up for our consideration. The commission will not be considering any proposal that weakens local democracy and New Yorkers' rights. A note on the process. You may be aware that we are not the only commission that is tasked with reviewing the charter. This commission is a distinct entity from the Charter Revision Commission that has been convened by the mayor. Both commissions are working simultaneously, but separately. For our part, this commission will continue to hold hearings like this one across the 5 boroughs and issue reports to get public and expert feedback on our ideas over the next several months. I'm joined today by David Seitzer as counsel, and I'd like to ask the members of the commission to briefly introduce themselves, and I will go ahead and start on this end. You can introduce yourself. Thank you.
Rachel Goodman, I'm the Chief of Staff to the New York City Controller and the Controller's appointee to the
Good evening, I'm Rod Jones. I'm the president at God of Riverside and Stanley Housing Enabling Centers.
Good evening, Robert Young, proud appointee of Bronx Borough President Vanessa L. Gibson.
I guess Robert had the shortest commute here. Joanne Yu, former executive director of the Asian American Federation and the appointee of Speaker Adams.
Hello, I'm Andrea Salomon-Kopel. I'm Executive Director of National Council of Jewish Women New York, and I'm an appointee of Speaker Adrienne Adams.
Good evening, Rahul Eichelwald, appointee of Mayor Adams.
Alan Swisher, appointee of Queensborough President.
And we have been joined online with a number of the members of the commission as well, if they could introduce themselves.
I'm Manny Pastreich, the president of SEIU Local 32BJ, and I was honored to be appointed by the speaker.
Sorry, they're speaking, but we can't hear them.
Can you try to take yourself off of mute?
Yeah, they're.
Sorry. Thank you. Mike Rassiopo, appointment of Borough President Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso.
Dr. Ram Raju, I'm the Senior Advisor to the Borough President of Staten Island for Intergovernmental Affairs and Health and Director of Economic Development, appointed by the Staten Island Borough President.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Serena Longley, and I am an appointee of New York City Council Speaker Adrienne Adams.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. My name is Mbake Cham. I'm the Housing and Health Community Organizer at Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York. There you go. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. My name is Mbake Cham. I'm the Housing and Health Community Organizer at Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all can hear me.
You had it on this one for one, try it again, see if that stops it from moving. You had it on this one for one, try it again, see if that stops it from moving.
Andy, can you try again to introduce yourself? Take yourself off of mute, introduce yourself. Andy, can you hear me? Can you try again to introduce yourself? Take yourself off of mute, introduce yourself.
Are you asking for me?
Yes.
Hi, sorry, I thought I did. I'm Manny Pastreich, the president of SEIU Local 32BJ, and proud to have been appointed by Speaker Adams.
Did introduce
Are you
yourself?
asking for me?
It's just we couldn't hear you.
Hi, sorry, I thought I did. I'm Manny Pastreich, president of SEIU Local 32BJ, and proud to have been appointed by Speaker Adams.
Wonderful.
Are you asking for me?
It's just we couldn't hear you.
Hi, sorry, I thought I did.
For people who to strengthen, I'm sorry. In relation to strengthening local democracy and improving government transparency and accountability through revision of the city charter. Commissioners are encouraged to ask questions based on the testimony given, and written testimony can be submitted to info@thecommission.nyc. And it can be of any length, and we welcome it up to 72 hours after this hearing. I'd like to ask our first witness. We're going to pause for a moment before we have the in-person testimony to make sure that it's properly recorded. Thank you for your patience. Our first witness, Matt McLeod, to come to the table. Please introduce yourself and please keep your remarks to 3 minutes. Matt?
Better?
Okay, cool. Hello, my name is Matt McLeod. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some feedback on the New York City Charter. I really want to say at the beginning, I appreciate the opportunity to speak freely. I believe it's a fundamental right, but one that I don't take for granted, so thank you. Okay, Chapter 1, Section 3. I don't think the mayor should be the chief executive officer of the city, as I consider CEO to be a corporate title and not one suited for government. Section 4. I do not think that a mayor who resigns or is removed from office prior to the completion of a full term should be deemed to have held that office for a full term. Section 8B. I also don't think the mayor should be considered a magistrate because the term magistrate has judicial connotations, and as I see it, the mayor represents the executive branch of city government. Section 9. The title of mayor should be referred to in gender-neutral terms. The same issue appears in sections 10D1, 4A through 4E, and 6B. Chapter 2, Section 24 and 25A. I do not think that a public advocate or city council member who resigns or is removed from office prior to the completion of a full term should be considered to have held that office for a full term. Section 35A. City council members should be referred to in gender-neutral terms. Chapter 4. Section 81B, again, a borough president who resigns or is removed from office prior to the completion of the full term should not be deemed to have served a full term. Chapter 15, Section 381, an authority to acquire real property. I don't think the city should have the right to take private property for the sake of public adornment. Chapter 18, Section 434B. Again, the police commissioner should not be the CEO of the police force. Additionally, the police commissioner should be referred to using gender-neutral terms. Section 435. The police should have the power to arrest all persons guilty of violating any law. I believe this should be amended to arrest all persons suspected of violating any law. Chapter 18D. Chapter 18D, Section 464, rules on firearm possessions for the city should be made gender neutral. Chapter 37, Section 851A. I would consider including a New York City music institution among this list. Chapter 50, Section 1138. I suggest term limits for all NYC elected positions be 2 full terms and not simply 2 consecutive terms. Chapter 66, Section 2402A. In stimulating community interest in the problems of aging, I recommend instead the process of aging. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide feedback on the New York City Charter.
For your thorough read of the city charter. Does any of our commissioners have any questions? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
We have a number of individuals on Zoom that are scheduled to testify as well. And so we would like to ask Anna Chapeni from the Citizens Budget Commission.
Hi, good evening. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony. My name is Anna Champany, and I'm the Vice President for Research at the Citizens Budget Commission. One recommendation that CBC would like to make that we believe would strengthen local democracy is to revise the charter to require that the city conduct and publish a statistically valid resident feedback survey at least every 5 years, with results at the community board level and disaggregated by key demographic groups. This would improve how the city serves New Yorkers, both today and in the future, by ensuring it can better understand and respond to New Yorkers' needs, the customers of city government. Everyone deserves a voice, and this would ensure that feedback is not dependent on having money or power. CBC itself conducted such a survey twice, in 2017 and 23, building upon a survey conducted by the city in 2008. The results, described in Straight from New Yorkers, available on our website, clearly illustrate the benefit of collecting these types of data and being able to compare change over time. For example, the survey shows how residents across the city's neighborhoods rate government services such as trash collection, health clinics, transportation, as well as public safety. This feedback directly from New Yorkers provides information the city needs to understand what is and is not working well and can guide both resource allocation and management improvement. Also, I want to add that over the past year, excuse me, CBC has developed a number of recommendations for revisions to the charter that would improve fiscal management. And as you continue to outline your scope, we welcome the opportunity to discuss our recommendations in these areas as well. Two I would like to highlight tonight quickly are that we believe the charter should require the city to deposit money into its rainy day fund when the economy is growing and preserve the fund for its intended purpose to protect New Yorkers from dramatic cuts during a recession or short-term emergency. At a minimum, we recommend mandatory formula-determined deposits, limiting withdrawals to a recession or severe emergency, and setting a target size. The second is that the charter requires that revenue and expenditure estimates be reasonable and appropriate. This is critically important and needs to be bolstered. The city has increasingly under-budgeted for planned spending, reaching unprecedented levels, distorting the city's fiscal picture, and compromising the accuracy of its financial plan, which serves as the foundation for budget decisions. So what we have recommended is that the charter require that the quarterly financial plans provide explanations when there are significant changes between tax revenue or program expenditures between 2 years, or when executive expense budget estimates vary by more than 20% from estimates by either the city or the state comptroller. Thank you.
That's what I'm going to go ahead and ask the commissioners if they have any to begin.
Thank you for your testimony. My question has to do with the surveys and with language access. That is always been a priority that personally for me great interest. And so, community boards often criticism of community boards. They don't often reflect the growing neighborhood changes. And so how do you account for making sure that all those opinions are counted and they are engaged? Because as is happening now, when I engage the planning community boards are not always effective in keeping their residents informed.
It's a little, sorry, a little difficult to hear on the Zoom, but I think one of the hallmarks of our survey and the one that the city did, which is why is this piece about it being statistically valid. It is a completely random sample of households, large enough to get, statistically valid results at the neighborhood level. It is a significant undertaking, and it gets harder each and every time to get a large enough sample, which is why we really think this is something that the city should be doing. But the intent is to be representative and reflective of each of the different neighborhoods and parts of the city, and understand how those residents that are in our survey are experiencing the services and quality of life in New York.
You probably know the consumer is going to be advocate of the rainy day fund. And I guess I'm curious if you have how you would sort of define the emergency that would allow for withdrawal. It seems like if you leave that a little vague, you could wind up with every mayor just determining what they decide is the emergency.
Well, that is our concern, because the current authorization in state law and then the city basically allows the mayor to withdraw up to 50% of the balance without any particular criteria. We have suggested that the withdrawals should be limited to a recession, which should be defined with some economic metrics. We've put forth some, the city comptroller has as well. And for a severe emergency, we are thinking of, our thought is a temporary an unexpected event that has a significant increase in expenditures or decrease in revenues, and you could put some dollar amounts around that. So that, it's not, so that you are really looking for something that has a significant impact on the city's ability to provide services, either because they need to provide a lot of additional services that were not in the budget, or because there's an unexpected shortfall in revenues that would be driven more by an economic shock than just a misforecast.
Well, thank you for your testimony tonight. I had another question about the resident feedback survey. Are you proposing that this survey in some way be incorporated into Chapter 10 of the charter with respect to the budget process? And if so, could you elaborate a little bit on how that might fit in to the various steps they're taking into consideration of the budget?
In terms of the resident feedback survey, we really think of it as a component and partner to the MMR and the requirements that the mayor produce, the mayor's management report, which has a lot of information about the city's services, but tends to focus more on counting the outputs, how many types of services are delivered, and less so gauging the quality of those services, and sort of combining this kind of resident feedback within the MMR process to really help hone in on where we need to improve the quality of our services.
Thank you.
A couple of quick logistical questions on that. So on the City Budget Commission, your resident feedback survey is funded by your agency?
Yes, for the last 2 times we have paid for it ourselves. We're if you're not familiar, we're a nonprofit, so we have fundraised and supported the cost.
And the other question that I had was in regards to, so you're suggesting that that function be taken over by the city, and which what entity would you suggest being responsible for actually conducting and producing the survey itself?
Given its connection to the MMR in our perspective, the one logical place would be within the mayor's office of operations. I will say we have thought numerous times about how one should structure performance management in New York City, and having one particular deputy mayor or high-level role in City Hall that is really responsible for driving efficient, high-quality service delivery in New York. And so this would fit into their portfolio. But I think the operations office, which already has some information, is already collecting data on services. And I have to, they have, so that would be where I think we would recommend.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to go on to Mr. Justin Sanchez, who I believe is here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to you guys for all being here. It is sad that there are more people on the board than there are in the crowd. So a few things. One, I would like to address that. I really commend the commission for doing all of their outreach. I think one of the things, though, is Lehman College is very hard to access for most Bronxites. And yes, it is close to a train station. Yes, it's on a college campus, but it took me at least 15 minutes walking around campus to even find where we were supposed to go. And so I know that a lot of the residents in the Bronx, this is really hard for them not only to access, but also to take advantage of. There are really great areas. A shameless plug to 3rd Avenue, the hub that gets over 300,000 people there every day. It's the 2nd most visited place after Times Square daily in our great city. That areas around there. There's the Metropolitan College of New York. That would have been really great resources to access more and more people and hopefully get a bigger crowd for such an important topic. Having said that, I just want to touch on some things that I think that the charter could really help. One, expanding advice and consent of the city council. Cities like Los Angeles and Chicago already have this, and I agree with previous testimony that has been before you in other parts of the city that show that when you have extra public scrutiny, you do end up with some of the best people. Furthermore, implementation of local laws. A lot of the times we know laws are passed, but not always fully implemented. Finding ways for the charter to ensure that when laws are passed, they're actually implemented in a due time and fashion. Revenue estimates, making sure that we have clear revenue estimates that one party is not saying something, another party is saying another, and it leads to sometimes devastating cuts, like our Sunday cuts to our libraries that were restored post, understanding that there was actually more money in the budget. Then following up some funding formulas for oversight agencies, like the CCRB, making sure that they're just always a funding stream for them that's not necessarily based on headcount, but rather dollar amount. And then destruction of landmark buildings. Making sure that when you are landmarked, that you stay landmarked, and there are no dangerous loopholes to change that, especially in communities like mine. We have a few landmark neighborhoods, and as gentrification continues to come for the Bronx, just making sure that we're not allowing ways for our landmarks to be destroyed. And finally, mayoral appointments to boards and panels, just finding ways to have extra abilities for people to have that oversight. So expanding that to having more seats for borough president, city council appointments, etc. Because it ends up being, in my opinion, a little more local, where you get more advice from people that are closer to the ground than that general executive oversight. And my time is up.
Do we have any questions? Start on this side. Questions from the commission? Do we have any questions from the commission? Okay.
I'm interested to hear a little more about your concerns about individually landmarked buildings and landmarked neighborhoods. Are you suggesting that once a building is individually landmarked by the Landmark Preservation Commission, that there be no process to undo that, that be sort of mandatorily kind of in perpetuity?
That is a great question. Not necessarily that there's no process, but to make that process have to go extreme scrutiny.
Maybe tell me a little more about sort of maybe what examples of what's happened and what's driving this recommendation.
For example, there are loopholes that allow developers to take over landmark buildings and make bigger adjustments than usual when it comes to landmark buildings or homes that exist. There are many landmark homes and streets in our neighborhoods, and just making sure that mega developers and folks that take advantage of the intent of a loophole have to actually prove substantively that there is issues that they need to make these adjustments for, and not just so that they can pad their bottom line or just find ways to get through what is a very difficult landmark process navigation.
Do you think the remedy might be kind of changing who's sitting at the table, evaluating the proposals and making the decisions? I don't know who's on the commission and how you feel about that.
I think that is definitely a possibility. It's, there's not one solution that'd be like the perfect answer. I think if there was, all of you guys wouldn't need to be here and listen to folks. But I think there are different ideas that people can push around. And one of those is, having different people sit on those boards, maybe making sure that some of the folks from the local community are involved in those conversations, making sure that, maybe a third of the folks that are listening to this proposal or, making that final decision come either from, the local 10-block radius, if we can be able to get folks to do that. Just making sure that there's a lot more community input so that we're not losing, really great resources and landmark buildings in our community.
Thank you.
I just had a quick follow-up question for you. You also mentioned, that Los Angeles and some other cities use advice and consent. And so I just wanted to know if there's particular, agencies that you think that should particularly have commissioners that would fall under that.
I think this is a conversation that multiple colleagues and multiple people need to have in a room together. I know this is a vigorous debate amongst many of the city council members, amongst the different mayors. So really just being able to sit down and understand, where are the lines that need to be drawn that need more advice? Is it the police commissioner? Is it DOI? Really understanding, where folks need, but also making sure that we're accounting for timelines. You don't want our city to be put on pause because, when the first mayoral administration is, let's say, certain parties are adversarial, that we're not actually getting our city moving forward. So finding the right balance of folks that need that advice and consent and ways to make sure that we're not holding our city back while we're actively trying to move it forward.
Any other questions? I want to thank you for your testimony and your suggestions for other places to hold our next set of hearings, because there will be another set. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day and stay dry.
Appreciate it. We're going to go back to the Zoom. And I believe I want to hear from Alan Abram from Communities United for Police Reform.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Alan Abraham, and I'm speaking on behalf of Communities United for Police Reform. CPR is an unprecedented campaign to end discriminatory and abusive policing practices in New York that's been operating for over a decade to build a lasting movement that promotes public safety and reduces our reliance on policing. We've brought together a movement of community members, lawyers, researchers, activists to work for change. And the partners in this campaign come from all 5 boroughs and all walks of life. The New York City Commission to Strengthen Local Democracy has an opportunity to advance changes to the New York City Charter that can bring increased transparency and accountability to the NYPD. CPR urges the Commission to explore options for increasing accountability for police killings, brutality, violence, and other police misconduct. Currently, the police commissioner has the final say over all discipline decisions, even when the CCRB recommends discipline. And the NYPD has proven it can't be trusted to hold its officers accountable, and there's a long history and culture of misconduct and impunity within the department. The commission should consider changes to the charter to promote meaningful and timely discipline in cases where officers engage in misconduct against New Yorkers. Furthermore, the commission should consider updating the formula for funding the CCRB so that CCRB is adequately staffed and resourced to meet the demands of its current caseload and jurisdiction. Due to severe understaffing, the CCRB has had to close a high number of qualifying cases without even investigating them, simply because of budgetary restraints and capacity limitations. In line with this, the commission should also consider limiting NYPD's use of specialized policing units, particularly the strategic response group, neighborhood safety teams, and community response teams, which have documented higher rates of police misconduct and abuse. The commission should also consider ways to limit the growing scope of policing into other areas of city government and support the development of alternatives that decrease our reliance on police to respond to crises, especially related to mental health and substance abuse. People in crisis deserve care, not to be criminalized and subjected to discriminatory and abusive policing practices. New York City should be developing and investing in non-police structures for providing that care and support. We also urge the commission to explore steps within its power to ensure NYPD is held accountable for complying with state and local laws, including city laws passed via the How Many Stops Act, Right to Know Act, and Community Safety Act, as well as state mandate required by the Police Statistics and Transparency Law, formerly known as the STAT Act, and others. These laws are results of years-long campaigning by communities directly impacted by the police that brings transparency and accountability. In the case of the STAT Act, the NYPD has been out of compliance with this mandated law for several reporting periods. Finally, CPR urges the commission to revisit the recent changes to the city charter that made it harder for the city council to legislate on policing issues. We need more accountability and oversight. The NYPD shouldn't have special rights to interfere with and slow down the process. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for the testimony. Can you give us a sense of where you think those points of pressures are for oversight and transparency? Like we heard the other day from this Citizen Review Board, they talked a bit about headcount and manpower, but I'm just trying to get a sense from you where you think those points of pressure are.
So it was a little difficult to hear you. I mean, can you just repeat that?
So I was asking a question about where you might recommend those points of pressure are for transparency and oversight. We heard a little bit from the CCRB earlier about manpower. And so I'm trying to get a sense of whether you're talking about other oversight avenues or if you're particularly far further to the point of the CCRB.
Yeah, I mean, so there's several areas I would say that I can follow up on, but one I would just highlight right now is, even for the laws that are passed, making sure that they're implemented properly. Like I mentioned, I know the STAT Act, it was a state law, but NYPD is simply not reporting on what they're supposed to be reporting on. So making sure that these laws are actually enforced is an important first step that I think, the commission can revisit. So, placing in enforcement restrictions and penalties could be one area. I'm happy to follow up as well.
This might be as much a question for David as for Alan, but are we permitted to look at the things that were passed in the last charter and change them? I think that's what he was recommending, looking at one of the proposals that came through the last charter.
Yeah, that I'm not exactly sure that answer, but I believe something.
Any questions on this side of the commission? Thank you so much for your testimony. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're now going to go to the next person, who is CJ Hayes.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I'll start my testimony now. Thank you so much for convening this meeting on the city charter and for inviting the public to give their input on the city charter. I feel that it is a great opportunity to participate in the democratic process and to give voice to my concerns as a resident of New York City. I am not affiliated with any nonprofit organization. I don't work in that space, but I am a citizen who thinks a lot about what the future of my democracy looks like, and I think we all need to make a concerted effort in protecting that. To that end, I think I would love to see a stronger codification protecting free speech in the New York City Charter. We have seen that it's not we are looking at the federal level, a curtailing of the right to free speech of legal citizens of the United States. But in New York City, we have seen under the current administration a crackdown on speech towards groups who are perpetrating violence. And whether or not you agree, you have a stance on a particular issue, it should be that citizens of New York and citizens of the United States have their freedom of speech protected. And I am deeply concerned about the precedent being set at the federal, city, and state level on our free speech and how that is going to be protected into the future. So I would love to see that somehow strongly codified in the next city charter. As for crime and crime reduction, I believe that policing is a reactive and not proactive response to violations of the law. So I would love to see the city charter articulate crime reduction and community safety as investments in housing, infrastructure, and education, because these are the things that we know we need to invest in and to protect and to shore up And we know that investments in these reduce crime. These kind of investments are an actual crime reduction tactic. I don't have much more to say, so I'll yield the rest of my time, and thank you so much for convening this meeting.
Any questions?
Can you share a couple ideas about crime reduction, the proactive response? I think everything should be proactive versus reactive, and so I'm curious to, as you put your testimony together, what were you thinking about?
Right. Thank you for the question. Police intervene once the crime has already happened. So it is necessarily a reactive response. If we take a sort of holistic approach to understanding what crime is, why crime happens, we can see that crime happens in places where there is underinvestment, where there is a lack of access to social services, where there's a lack of access to housing, to healthcare, to education. We know that, or we have known in the past, that people determine how many prison beds we'll need by by students' reading levels at around the third or fourth grade, I believe. And given that we've seen given that we've seen students miss their academic milestones in the years following the pandemic, I think it's relevant to assume that we might see an uptick in crime if we're not addressing these missed educational milestones. So investing in education, investing in housing, investing in mental health services so that people who are going through a mental health crisis do not need to live on the street, do not need to live on the trains, and then commit an act of violence and then find themselves in the prison industrial complex. Those are all more proactive means of reducing crime now and into the future. It's more of a long-termist approach as opposed to a short-termist approach.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Regarding protecting free speech, which I couldn't agree more. Have you looked into at all the protections in the New York State Constitution? And if so, do you think that they are sufficient, or could you maybe expand on that and the need for something at the city level?
Of course, and I will just say no. I'm a citizen, and so I don't position myself as an expert on, the charter or the state constitution or what have you. However, I do think at this moment it is important to affirm to all persons, regardless of their views, as long as as it is not hate speech. And actually, I think we should take the time to clearly define what hate speech is, and at the risk of, making myself a target, I think people who are critiquing a state that is publicly using violence as a tactic for whatever means, critique of that should be allowed. And so we need to protect people's right to protest. We need to protect people's right to critique. We need to create a very clear definition of what hate speech is, because if it's too ambiguous, we are liable to let anything be articulated as hate speech. And that is going to be a fundamental inhibitor to advancing justice and calling out inequity when we see it. So codifying free speech at the city level, at the state level, but also creating a very clear definition of what hate speech is, how it functions, what it does to a community, so that there are clear parameters for what is and is not that.
Thank you.
Thank you. No other questions? Thank you so much for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I also want to have one other person who is on the line. My apologies in advance for the pronunciation of your name, but I have Mbashe Ian.
I think it's me. My name is Michael Chom, and I'm the Housing and Health Community Organizer at Center for Independence of the Disabled, New York. I hope you all can hear me.
Could you say your name one more time correctly for us all, and then you can start into your testimony?
Can you hear me?
Hear me? You could just say your name correctly for the record, because I'm pretty sure I didn't say it correctly. So if you could say it correctly for the record and then give us your testimony. We'd love to hear from you.
My name is Michael Chom. I'm the Housing and Health Community Organizer at Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York. Thank you for the opportunity to submit our testimony on proposed changes to the New York City Charter. So I'm submitting this testimony along with my colleagues, Molly Sennock and Anna Humphrey, who are also community organizers at Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York. As the commission evaluates potential revision to the NYC Charter, we urge you to prioritize the following reform to strengthen local democracy and ensure full inclusion of people with disabilities in the city governance. 1, the NYC Charter should ensure accessibility by explicitly requiring that all public hearings, participatory budgeting sessions, and community board meetings be fully accessible. This includes providing American Sign Languages, ASL, interpretation, live captioning, and accessible digital participation option by default, not just upon request. The Charter should expand disability representation in the city government. We recommend amending the Charter to require a disability advisory committee to provide guidance on accessibility and equity across all agencies. Additionally, there should be dedicated seats for people with disabilities on major decision-making bodies, including NYC Planning Commission and the Civic Engagement Commission. 3, proposed changes to the Charter should be provided to the public in plain language and well enough in advance to allow for public comment. The information provided should be accurate and accessible to ensure that voters are well informed and can participate in the process. As the city works on strengthening local democracy, it is critical that people with disabilities are We urge the Commission to incorporate these reforms into NYC Charter and ensure that accessibility remain at the forefront of governance. Thank you. Time and consideration. And yeah.
Thank you for bringing up those needs of the disabled community. We appreciate your testimony. With that said, we have our last witness to address the group, and that is Jim Perez. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we go to that, I wanted to thank Commissioner Serena for being on the line. I know that you introduced yourself earlier, but we had a little bit of a sound issue. So if you wanted to introduce yourself one more time, we'd appreciate it. And then we'll go to Jim.
Hi, sure. Chair Rice, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi, everyone. This is Serena Longley. I am appointed by New York City Council Speaker Adrienne Adams. Happy to be here.
Can you hear me? Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, but barely.
Okay, you have the floor.
That's better. Now I can hear you. Thank you. Good evening, Chair Rice and Commissioners. My name is Jim Karras. I have a long history in city government. I've been general counsel and acting finance director at the council, general counsel and land use director at the Manhattan Borough President's Office, a commissioner on the 2019 New York City Charter Revision Commission, and I just left my class on state and local government, where I was teaching home rule and charter revision to my second and third year law students at New York Law School. So thank you for letting me speak tonight. I'm here completely in my personal capacity. So I think the commission should be focusing on government integrity and accountability. And I don't think government integrity is limited to just anti-corruption measures, as important as those are. I think ensuring that there are guardrails on significant power and that power is not unduly concentrated is part of government integrity and good government. So I have a few suggestions today. One is to consider advice and consent for significant city commissioners. 2, look at putting some meat and procedure on Charter Section 9, removal of the mayor. 3, compel the DOI commissioner to appoint a high-level deputy or assistant commissioner to review, audit, and oversee the use of city overtime and leave time by agencies and promulgate overtime guidelines. 4, create a process to revise the unit of appropriations in the expense budget to make them more programmatic and in line with the intent behind those provisions in the 1989 charter revision. And I will briefly go through each suggestion, and my portion on the units of appropriation is somewhat lengthy. So if you'd like me to cut it short, just let me know and I'll submit the remainder in writing, but I give a couple of examples. So advice and consent by the council on key mayoral commissioners. I testified on this last year. I think the process of appointing city commissioners can be improved by subjecting them to council advice and consent, and that arguments against this really carry very little weight. First, advice and consent is a salutary check on appointment power. It's been a pillar of government in this country since its founding. Second, New York City is an outlier among the largest cities in this country in its lack of any role in the appointment of agency heads. And third, the council has demonstrated that it has handled advice and consent well and responsibly in those office holders over whom it has advice and consent. This is a guardrail. Alexander Hamilton wrote that it is to guard against potential abuse of unchecked executive appointment power that could result in an unfit or compromised appointee. I mean, we don't need guardrails when things are running smoothly and fine. What the guardrails are for the problematic situations. And I think, and while perhaps a few years ago, I would have been more hesitant to suggest this specifically, I think that given that the mayor has treated the CCRB disciplinary findings as no more worthy of his consideration than a letter from an annoying constituent, the commission should seriously consider giving the council advice and consent over the police commissioner as one of those key commissioners. Removal of the mayor in Charter Section 9. Section 9 of the city charter has been in the charter in some similar form for most of the last 150 years, but it's never actually been used to remove a mayor. Almost 100 years ago, FDR was on the verge of removing Mayor Jimmy Walker using this provision. When realizing the end was near, Mayor Walker resigned. But there was some controversy over the use of the provision, and a judge at the time stated he believed FDR should follow certain procedures and employ certain standards, but he didn't enjoin the mayor's undertaking of the removal hearings in Albany. So I think the commission should look at including some standards in this section, perhaps along the line of some of the judge's suggestions in that case. And while leaving the ultimate authority with the governor, give the city's local legislative body, the city council, a role. This could be accomplished by providing that the charges referred to in the provision could be submitted to the governor by the city council after an investigation and a hearing. This would put the council in a similar position to the state legislative committee that investigated Mayor Walker in 1931, or to look at it another way, the council could be filing something with the governor similar to articles of impeachment in an impeachment proceeding. But ultimately, the governor would have the ultimate authority over what, if anything, to do with them. Units of appropriation in the city expense budget. I fought hard in the 2019 Charter Commission to reform the building blocks of the city's expense budget. And those are the legal building blocks of the expense budget are called the units of appropriation. According to the city charter, each unit of appropriation for each agency is supposed to represent an amount requested for personal service or OTPS for a quote, particular program, purpose, activity, or institution. And the charter also expressly prohibits large multi-programmatic UAs unless the council specifically allows it, which it never has. However, until very recently, and still in some instances, whole agency budgets were essentially contained in a couple of units of appropriation. That means that rather than being programmatic or particular, as the charter requires, agencies are lumping almost all of their programs in small number of U of A's. This gives the mayor and the agency head an enormous amount of power they were not intended to have under the charter. If an agency has all its programs in a couple of units of appropriation, it means that legally it is totally within the mayor's discretion as to what programs within that unit to fund and at what levels. This severely takes away the council's role of setting policy through the budget. Speaker Adams has done a tremendous job at starting to curb this abuse. She has used the budget process to get the administration to begin to divide some of these enormous units of appropriation. She has probably been responsible for more units of appropriation in the budget than any other speaker, and quite possibly than most of the other speakers combined. However, the job is not done and should not rest on the efforts, however tremendous, of one or two speakers. And a speaker should not be having to use her energies during the budget negotiations to get the administration to follow the charter. Also, the progress made has in some cases broken very large units up into functional areas, but even large programs within these areas are not specifically isolated. And there are still some agencies that have not been touched, like the Department of Homeless Services, which has almost $3.5 billion of its $4 billion budget in one single unit of appropriation. If I can give an example as to why I think this is so problematic. Let's say a group of council members did not want to give additional funding to the Department of Corrections without certain reforms. But there was a series of inmate deaths and injuries resulting from a lack of medical care for the incarcerated individuals, so they wanted to increase inmate health services. Before Speaker Adams' efforts the last couple years, many of which were centered on the NYPD and Department of Corrections, there would be no way to put money into this area and assure legally that it's spent on inmate care because there was no separate unit of appropriation for inmate care. They would have had to put the money into a really big U of A and trust in an understanding with the mayor and the agency that the money would be used for that purpose. And if the mayor changed his mind, he would not need council approval in the form of a budget mod to use the money for a different purpose within the Department of Corrections. This example has been fixed thanks to Speaker Adams' work. But currently, as I said, we have agencies like Homeless Services with $3.5 billion of a $4 billion budget in one unit of appropriation. And it's my understanding that Homeless Services has contracts for shelter services for families with children that total almost $500 million. You can't tell me that the administration cannot figure out how to separate even these enormous contractual amounts into separate units of appropriation. I know the administration will argue that it's really hard to do. It will hamstring the agency. Different programs have pieces and staff that work on different things. They are smart people. They can figure this out just as they did for the Department of Corrections. And please, we can't just limit these reforms to the low-hanging fruit like these huge Department of Homeless Services $500 million contracts. The charter should require a review of the current unit of appropriation structure with the goal of making them all more programmatic, and should ensure that the charter language is followed going forward so that new programs, such as all the ones set up to deal specifically with migrants, are separated out and not included in a U of A with other agency programs. Next, Department of Investigations overtime and some type of inspector general office dealing with overtime. I recommend something that may not, under ordinary circumstances, be a proposal for a charter change, but given the fact that I've been hearing about the problem for over 30 years, I think that its staying power as a constant thorn in the city's side may make it an appropriate subject for charter reform. I would recommend that the commission consider requiring the DOI commissioner to appoint a high-level deputy or assistant commissioner to function as an agency overtime IG with the mandate to review and audit agency overtime and leave usage. They should have access to all agency overtime records and should be required to come up with overtime guidance for agencies and monitor the agency's compliance with the guidance. And I think that rather than report solely to the mayor on this issue, the office should consult and also report to the comptroller. Finally, let me talk about two state issues that I think are really important to democracy and a good functioning democracy, but that the city may not be able to directly affect. Maybe there is something this commission can push for or make changes to facilitate. Those issues are the timing of local elections and the broad executive powers with respect to emergencies. I have long thought city elections should be moved so that they are not off-year elections with very low voter participation. I know this is a state constitutional issue, but I think this would be one of the most important democracy reforms. It has been suggested to me that moving city elections to presidential election years could increase the politicization and polarization of local elections, and that makes sense to me. But I can't understand why we wouldn't want local elections to be held with state elections. In the case of emergency orders by the mayor, governed primarily by state law, we now know that emergencies can last for years. In these cases, I believe state law gives too much power to one local actor, the mayor. I think anything you can do to make the mayor more accountable and transparent in the use of these powers would be beneficial to the city. Also, ultimately, it seems to me that we should consider pushing the state to give the local legislative bodies some role in emergencies that are not limited in duration. I'm happy to answer any questions.
With Commissioner Longley, who's joining us on Zoom. Commissioner, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you for the testimony. I do have a question. Along your theme with checks and balances, in particular on mayoral power, do you have any ideas for potential reforms to the Office of the Public Advocate to make it a more powerful check on the mayor?
I think, unfortunately, I haven't considered the public advocate as the public advocate. I think in my sort of fantasy city government world, the public advocate might be some kind of more like an attorney general type figure and would have the law department, the conflicts of interest board, DOI, the CCRB, all the watchdog agencies under it. But that would be a significant change to the structure of city government and how we do business. And I haven't yet figured out whether that would be elective or done by some kind of nationwide search, sort of like we do for the IBO director.
Thank you.
Follow up to that. If not, I'm going to go to the commissioners in the room. Start on this one.
Hi, Jim. This is Alan Swisher.
Hi.
So I did have a question about advice and consent. You did mention the MRP commissioner as an official that you believe at this point should be subject to advice and consent by the council. Are you suggesting that all commissioners should be, or just particular commissioners? Can you elaborate?
I think that depends, I've heard pushback that having so many commissioners and the vetting necessary for so many commissioners could significantly slow down the process. So I think that's more up to you guys to work with the council in deciding. I mean, it's certainly, if the council had the capacity to and the staff to do it, I think it's a good guardrail that most other major cities use that doesn't, give like I said, Alexander Hamilton said, it doesn't stop the mayor from nominating who he wants. What it stops is some crazy thing from happening, some unfit person from getting through. And in my experience at the city council, there were more than a few instances where I felt that the council's vetting job of appointees that came before it was significantly better than the administration's job of doing it. So I think if it can be done in a timely manner, there would be no harm in doing it for all commissioners. If that's unclear, then maybe start with some key commissioners and see how it goes, and then, work from there.
Jim, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Rahul Langwal, nice to meet you. Thanks.
Nice to meet you too.
I just got a few questions. Really interesting idea on the DOI overtime issue. I guess my question is, would you give any particular power to that individual with respect to either cutting or doing anything, to actually take action, if an agency is exceeding overtime?
I mean, I haven't thought it out well enough, and I wanted to sort of get it in because I know I believe one of my mentors, Herb Berman, former chair of the Council Finance Division, wrote a report on this in 1994. I mean, there's never been a year where this hasn't been a big issue. So I think we just have to start getting our arms around it. And I thought that the best way to do it was had somebody, reasonably independent, like perhaps somebody at DOI, where the DOI commissioner is at least, somewhat more independent than other commissioners, is subject to advice and consent by the council. And that's why I thought of, sort of also a direct report to the controller, because the more independent we could make that, the better. But ultimately, I do think, at least and I could be wrong about this, but you can't have somebody completely outside of an agency, especially perhaps a critical agency, telling people they can't work. There could be a crisis. There could be, so I'm trying to do it in a way that's as respectful of everybody's role as I can, but I think those details would have to be looked at and worked out.
Yeah, but I take your testimony, sort of at a high level to suggest that we, as a commission, take a look at the issue of overtime.
I think unless somebody semi-neutral looks at this, it's going to go on for another 30-something years in the same vein.
Well, we look forward to your testimony in 30 years, Jim.
I fortunately will not be here.
So on advice and consent, I guess, you talked about how advice and consent provides guardrails, to prevent sort of, I think you said, the crazy, person from being, I suppose, nominated or sitting as an agency head. And I have a couple of questions, right? One is, what sort of guardrails do you envision being in place with respect to the advice and consent power specifically? In other words, are there timing guardrails? Are there guardrails in terms of what particular mechanisms the council can use to say no? In other words, would you put particular qualifications in place or, guidance to the city council to say you can reject a nominee in this particular situation? In other words, are there things that you're envisioning that would provide a check on sort of, the ability, I think, of advice and consent to otherwise potentially really jam up the process?
I don't think that I would put substantive guidelines in, because I think that would be difficult, and I've never heard of that before. I don't, with the law department, And now I'm forgetting from 2019. I was one of the biggest proponents of advice and consent on the Corporation Council in 2019. And I think that has worked quite well, you know. I think the council has approved 2 or 3 and not approved 1. So, you know, I don't think it's been abusive at all in that regard. And I think the same is true with DOI commissioners, you know, which that advice and consent power has been around for a long time. So I don't think the council has demonstrated that it, you know, it would tend to abuse that authority. Maybe, you know, I wish I could remember if there was a time limit for the law department or not, but I'm just not recalling at the moment.
Understood. I do think quite candidly that some would disagree with you with respect to the disapproval of the last corporation council candidate, as to whether or not the council either abused its authority or did sort of act in the way that you're suggesting they act, namely to, you know, reject someone who was quote, sort of the crazy outlier. I don't know that that's the way that people would sort of regard the last corporation council.
No, and I'm not referring to anyone specifically. When I made that comment, it was just about the general concept of advice and consent.
But applying the general concepts to history sort of, you know, potentially leads us to a place where it may not be exactly the way you're envisioning it, you know, in a perfect world.
Yeah, and look, and sometimes advice and consent works because, or sometimes advice and consent is withheld because of, and again, I'm not talking about the specific instance, because of serious policy differences. I mean, look at our cases with Senate advice and consent over Supreme Court justices, but that tends to be the outlier case. And I think the guardrail is worth running the risk that you may have, you know, a couple outliers or situations where you don't think advice and consent should have been withheld.
Understood. I take your point to say the guard. I get it. You're willing to sacrifice potentially the issues that you're talking about in favor of.
Yeah, no system, just like no system's going to work perfectly. You know, it just can't be. Humans operate all of these systems. So I think better to have the guardrail than to not.
Last question, just on the issue of timing of local elections. Obviously an important issue and one that could drive up turnout significantly if we can align them with state elections. I know you said that it's beyond our capacity to do something legally about that. That seems right. Do you have suggestions for ways in which we could influence the state to take action in that respect, as this commission?
I mean, you know, look, is it, you know, how much influence is it going to carry in your report? I believe we made in 2019 a list of asks to Albany at the end of our report. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's hard, you know, I mean, especially given my understanding is, and I looked at this several months ago, but it's been a while. My understanding is it requires a constitutional amendment, which is even harder than, you know, getting the legislature to act. I don't know if there's, you know, something we could put in the charter that would sort of set us up for that, the way we set things up for a rainy day fund that we didn't yet have the authority to do, that might sort of goose the legislature to act. I don't know if that approach would prove fruitful here, but it's something, you know, perhaps you could look at.
Action, appreciate it.
We have 5 more commissioners in the room, just so that you know, we're going to make sure that they have opportunities to ask the questions they have. And then we also have a commissioner on Zoom who has a question as well, just so you can keep track of that, and it is exported. Commissioner, you do have a question? Okay. All right, we're going to go back to the Zoom then to Commissioner Lumley. I believe you had another question.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly returning to what you were just discussing with the last commissioner about the city council and the corporate, advice and consent with respect to the corporation council. My understanding was that the city council did not vote down a candidate, but I guess I would ask, my understanding was a candidate may have withdrawn.
Withdrawn, you're right.
So has the city council actually ever voted down a candidate since that advice and consent requirement was put into the city charter for the corporation council?
Not to my knowledge, with you having corrected me. I mean, I'm trying to think of instances where we voted down other, for example, city planning commission nominees, and none are usually when it becomes apparent that I mean, oftentimes, and I think why this is such a good guardrail, I think my experience at the council was that oftentimes we catch things that the administration didn't catch, or they may have, whoever caught them may have underestimated the severity of. And when we catch them, it derails the nomination in a sort of private manner. Then there's the bucket where it's becoming apparent where it's going to be a no-go and the nomination is withdrawn. So I think that's much more likely to happen, those scenarios, than a negative vote on advice and consent.
And do you think there's a difference in terms of when we're thinking about the potential abuse of this? Do you think, which I'm not sure there's any evidence of that happening, like you stated, but hypothetically, do you think there's a difference between a candidate withdrawing and being actually voted down when you're considering whether this is a power that could be abused?
I guess it depends. I think it depends sort of where along the spectrum that happens, how much the administration may begin to agree that this isn't the best idea, in which case a nomination is withdrawn, which in that case, I think if the council were to have problems with a nominee and the administration were to come to say, yeah, maybe this isn't the best person, I mean, that's a great outcome, a great outcome for an unfortunate nominee, but you know what I'm saying. So I think it's very fact specific. And again, you can't guarantee that there's not going to be we just fundamentally differ with this person and we don't want them in this position,
Two quick clarifying questions for you, Jim. And then I do know that our city councilwoman Aviles, is still on the line. So I want to make sure she has an opportunity to share her testimony as well. But Jim, I just wanted to ask, just clarifying, you mentioned specifically for advice and consent about the police commissioner. And so that was one that you wanted to add in addition to the corporate council, and there were no other additions, or was that your primary one you wanted to make sure was on the record?
No, I think my understanding was that in the local law that the council passed that's subject to referendum, there were a host of commissioners, but that the police commissioner was not one of them. So my goal in singling out the police commissioner wasn't just to say only the police commissioner. It was to say that to the extent in the past, the police commissioner has been excluded from consideration, that I think it's time, and that the timing and the circumstances, nothing against the current police commissioner, who from an outside observer seems to be doing some things anyway that I think need to be done. But I think given the history of the last few years and the CCRB, the way the CCRB has been disregarded, it's time to consider adding the police commissioner to the other commissioners that you are considering.
One of the clarifying questions talking about your oversight and the review of overtime, and you wanted that at the deputy mayor level or deputy commissioner at Department of Investigations. I was just unclear.
Deputy commissioner at the Department of Investigations, I was thinking.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. 3 minutes. Okay, thank you so much, Jim, for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
hear from our city councilwoman, Aviles. Are you still on the line?
Yes, good evening. How is this?
More time, we have 10 minutes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify this evening. I'm so delighted to hear the voice of Jim Karas. His expertise is truly admirable, and we desperately miss him at council. So really great to have him here this evening. So thank you, commissioners, again for the opportunity to testify. My name is Councilmember Alexa Aviles, and I represent the 38th District in Brooklyn, which includes the communities of Sunset Park, Red Hook, parts of Gowanus, Park Slope, Dyker Heights, Bensonhurst, and Bath Beach. I also have the honor of serving as the chair on the committee on immigration. So the communities of both Red Hook and Sunset Park in my district contain a very large portion of land within the significant maritime and industrial areas, also known as SMIA. These areas were designated in 1992 as part of a comprehensive waterfront plan to protect and encourage concentrated working waterfront uses. These areas in an ideal world should be characterized by clusters of industrial firms and water-dependent businesses. However, in my time as council member, beginning in January of 2022, what we've seen is a gradual chipping away at this designation through a lack of cohesive waterfront planning, and a situation which leaves our communities really vulnerable to displacement of much of the needed family supporting jobs and an influx of polluting businesses that do not make use of waterfront land they sit on. So today I just wanted to urge the commission to consider adding to the city charter an office of the waterfront, so that economic development projects such as those happening at the Brooklyn Marine Terminal do not threaten to gentrify our waterfronts, our working waterfronts, but really have a comprehensive view and engagement on how we are using this critical asset of our city. Such an office should consider just some of the following: comprehensive waterfront planning that focuses not just on waterway and public access, but includes the consideration of appropriate maritime uses and possible waterway zoning, developing policies that incentivize or mandate maritime use, especially for businesses that take up residency along the waterfront, designing the considerations that will make shorelines more amenable to maritime uses than solely just pedestrian or recreational use. Many know that as hardened waterfront lines where you can't berth boats. And I realize my time is going on, so I can submit the rest of my testimony. And I will conclude by saying thank you. And I would also like the commission to consider the notion of a strengthening or creating an agency on immigration that will increase lines of accountability and coordination across city agencies where we're seeing not very good coordination and a real inability to hold agencies accountable to their mandates. And so with that, I ran out of time, but I thank you and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, City Councilwoman. We appreciate that testimony and wanted to see if our commissioners had any questions. Commissioner Yu.
Hi, council member, how are you? My
Good,
question,
how are you?
my question is around the immigration agency. How would that differ from Moya?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. I ended up not talking about any part of that. So you'll see it in my testimony when I submit it. I think what we're seeing, the challenges of Moya is a lack of accountability. Moya advises but has no full budget. We see immigration services kind of throughout city agencies, and Moya often can't respond around what is happening with those programs, whether they're following particular mandates. So we'd like to see something where there is a stronger level of accountability and stronger ability to shape programs, rather than just providing some advice and agencies kind of doing as they wish with no kind of ability to engage in real discussion around what is actually happening with those services.
And my other question was on EDC. That's a weird hybrid thing, right? It's not a city agency. It wears multiple hats, multiple identities, and I'm wondering if you can talk about potential problems when you're talking about the waterfront development and EDC's role. If you can talk about the potential for not perhaps having enough guardrails for EDC.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think EDC's mandate is growing every day. Fundamentally, they're there to, they're not a government agency. They're there to make resources, to make, I'm losing my words, I've had a long day, to bring income to the city. And that kind of competing mandate across multiple uses could actually undermine the work that we're talking about here. So the work of guarding our waterfront and making sure that we have an agency that is fully competent, deeply embedded, and doesn't have conflict of interest in terms of undermining use. So let me give you maybe a quick example. We have a terminal, actually we have a pier that we have maritime businesses on that pier. EDC understands it can also generate revenue by renting that pier to concerts. And then you have suddenly competing interests of both need it, but maybe one is a larger revenue generating source, although fleeting, and the other one is a more consistent business that is there all around. If the agency is just chasing revenue, it may move away from its core functional business purpose, which is maritime businesses. And this is kind of what we see. So having an agency that is really focused and deeply embedded in maximizing the use and management of our waterfront that is, 365 days a year is really critical. I think we have, over 300 miles of waterfront. Given climate change, this is a serious task that can't be the add-on to an agency. And I think, we need, I think it's due time that we actually focus there. EDC is building schools and looking at helicopters. It's all over the place. I don't think it does a good service to the needs for maritime waterfront agency.
Can I chime in?
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, no, I would just, it's less of a question. Hi, nice to meet you, Councilmember Beals. I would, well, I'm not sure of necessarily the structure of the agency. I would agree with the criticism of EDC and why it would really be something to look at a waterfront focused agency, because I'm also on the Brooklyn Marine Terminal Task Force with Councilmember Aviles, and I think the experience has been one where it is comparable to, like I've compared it to the going into it, dealing with EDC is like has been like dealing with a private developer on a ULURP as opposed to one when, like with city planning on the Gowanus rezoning, is something that looked at it from a more macro scale perspective. And I think the cross uses and things like that, it's not a, if you give the EDC this task, I think this is inevitably the result. I don't think that they're acting necessarily in the wrong way. It's just they shouldn't be in charge of this. So I think I'm just saying I agree with Councilmember Aviles. I don't really have a question for you.
Yeah, no, I would just say, it's not that it's not that they're trying their best, but when you have an agency that has such a broad range of like mandates, and quite literally, the city throws almost any project its way that it can't fit. I mean, they're building charter schools, they're, trying to figure out the, the blue highway, they're building housing. I mean, it's all over the place. So I think it is high time that we look very comprehensively at having an agency that can seriously manage this asset. Our waterways are critical, particularly in the context of climate change and wanting to move trucks off of our streets, which, have been a huge and growing problem. So I just think it's something, it's not to say they don't have good intention or they haven't been trying very hard. I just think it's too many uses and we should be doing more focused work in this area.
Commissioner, would you go ahead and state your name and you're appointed by for the record? Apologies for not calling you earlier.
I'm sorry, was that for me? I didn't hear you.
Could you state your name and who you were appointed by for the record?
Me, Mike Graciobo, appointed by Borough President Reynosa. As I said in the intro.
Any questions? Okay, so thank you so much, City Councilwoman, for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Good night. More to come.
Good night. Yes, we look forward to receiving your testimony in writing. And apologies you were not able to complete it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to remind everyone that hearings will resume at the end of April after the release of our preliminary report. And that's going to be starting in Queens on April 29th at Flushing Public Library. All hearings are from 5 to 7 p.m. and folks are invited to testify either in person or via Zoom. Registration and further details on all hearings are on our website at www.thecommission.nyc. I want to thank everyone who testified today, watched online or in person, and the commission staff who put this hearing together. Are there questions or are there any questions or other business from commissioners before we adjourn? No? Okay, hearing none. Is there a motion to adjourn? Is there a second? All in favor? Any opposed? Okay. The motion is passed and we are adjourned. Thank you so much.